The Glen Afton Line is a heritage railway in New Zealand's Waikato region and located around 40 kilometres, or a 31-minute long drive, from the city of Hamilton. Their passenger trains run on the first Sunday of each month, with either steam or diesel locomotives doing the honours. On this occasion, the star attraction was a Climax geared steam locomotive, and I'll give a brief overview of her history later in the video. Unfortunately, the Climax didn't haul the passenger train on the day of our visit, and we only saw her shuttling up and down the yard. Meanwhile, the train was handled by the Drewry twins and Peckett 060 tank number 1630. The main train was closely followed by a very strange contraption, known as the Bush Jigger. It is effectively New Zealand's equivalent of the Rio Grande Southern's Galloping Goose, and this little shunt was the only time I saw the Bush Jigger moving throughout the day. The Climax is a very unusual locomotive designed to have good pulling power, albeit at the expense of a low top speed. Between 1888 and 1928, at least 1,000 of these things were built, across 3 classes, and they became the stuff of legend for their work in the logging industry. In the case of locomotive number 1650, she was built in 1924 and spent her entire life working on bush tramways in the Ongarue and Mangapehi area. In other words, a very remote part of the North Island between the towns of Taumaru Nui and Te Kuiti. At the time of her withdrawal in 1969, Climax 1650 was one of the last geared steamers still running in New Zealand. 1650 was very lucky to be preserved by the Bush Tramway Club, although her restoration would take decades to complete. In 2013, ownership transferred to the Climax 1650 Steam Trust Board, and restoration continued at Pitcorn Engineering's workshop in Te Kuiti, of all places. 1650 finally came back to the Glen Afton Line in late March 2025, and has since won the Motat Society Steam Locomotive Restoration Award. On a personal note, she's not the only Climax I've seen in person, as one of her classmates, number 1203, can be found at Shantytown in the South Island. However, 1203 hasn't run under her own power since the early 2000s, and is now just a static exhibit in the workshop, along with a Heisler and the little Mills A. After coming off the passenger train to take on water, Peckett 1630 ran over to the yard and parked over the pit. While the Peckett had her ashpan cleaned out, at least it looked like that's what was happening, the passenger service kept running, now with both Drewry twins in charge. For whatever reason, there was a tiny dog running all over the track by the water crane, so the diesels had to move along at a snail's pace until the dog was finally out of the way. The Glen Afton Line is a rare instance of a heritage railway where visitors are welcome to walk around the yard and sheds as they please, and after wandering around the yard for a fair while, we thought it was finally time to actually go for a train ride. Ours was the 1:45 PM departure off Puke-Miro Junction, and the Peckett was put back on the train in place of Drewry 402. I spent most of the journey sitting in car van AF 1047, partly because the other coach, A1319 Mary, was much busier, but also because I didn't like the awful stink of Drewry 401's exhaust and wanted to get away from it. Because I struggle to handle being in a cramped space with lots of other people about, I don't like riding aboard these old wooden coaches when they're busy, so I was lucky to have AF 1047 to myself for most of the journey. When we got to the eastern end of the line, near the point where the Heritage Railway was severed from the rest of the branch line off of Huntly, Drewry 401 was uncoupled from the train, thus leaving Peckett 1630 to take the train back to the station all on her own. Upon arrival back at the station, we found the Climax parked just beyond the platform in the run-round loop. Something I've forgotten to mention this whole time is the complete lack of big mainline engines on this line, which sets it apart from other heritage railways in New Zealand, such as the Goldfields Railway in Waihi, and although their service is often hauled by a Bagguley Drewry shunter, or TR845 as soon as she's ready, at least 4 bigger locomotives, that's DSC 2338, the Niigata shunter, and the 2 DBRs, are also based on this line. This concludes my coverage of the Glen Afton Line and their September 2025 open day. As far as I know, there are only 4 operational Climax locomotives in the entire world, so I consider it a great honour to have seen 1650 in steam at the Glen Afton Line. I may not have any commercial connection to the Bush Tramway Club, but I would still recommend a visit to their line if you get the chance. I'll include a link to the Society's website in the description, and to close off the video, I'll leave you with footage of the Climax heading off towards Glen Afton, followed by a bonus catch on the North Island main trunk just south of Huntly.